Chapter 5. The Not-so-Phoney War, September 1938 to Christmas 1939. On returning from Malta, my parents had two important tasks during Kenneth's leave. The first was to recover a number of their possessions from the family who had rented Lumley Croft during our absence. Their name was Ashton, and, having left with some of our stuff, they failed to respond to letters or phone calls. One Sunday we all set off to Fareham to seek them out, and my parents simply went round their house picking up things that belonged to us. The father was another naval officer, and they had a son of about my age. My impression is that there was considerable irritation on our side, but no malice on their part. It seems that Mrs. Ashton was hopelessly vague, and simply unaware of what was hers and what was ours. The other important task of that summer was to find a school for me. It was normal at that time in families like ours that I should go to a boarding prep school. We visited several possible schools and chose St Andrew's School, Pangbourne, in rural Berkshire. It was a new school founded in 1934, so that some of the original pupils were still in the school in 1938. It was smaller than some of its longer established and better known rivals, such as Horace Hill and Cheam. I do remember the visit to St Andrews because of the open-air swimming pool. Having spent a lot of time in the sea when in Malta, this appealed to me, and the next summer I soon learned to swim in that pool. My mother took me up to the school in our car at the beginning of my first term. In those days there was no dual carriageways and few bypasses, except for the Kingston and Guildford bypasses on the A3, spoken of as the last word in modernity. The route was unfamiliar, and Mother planned it through the towns. I held the list and gave her the next place to head for as we reached each intermediate goal. I don't, of course, remember every place, but feel sure that Petersfield and Hindhead were early markers, and this may have been my first acquaintance with the mysterious Devil's Punch Bowl. This navigating activity was probably deliberately planned to keep me occupied and not too nervous at the approaching separation. I was about a month short of my 8th birthday. I remember my first sight of the school, and the first evening after Mother had left was not a happy one. I was certainly scared at the idea of going away from home among strange people for 3 whole months, though the staff were kindly enough. I remember the first evening being reluctant to eat my tea at 6:30 p.m. or thereabouts. I was told that it was the last meal before breakfast, and I would be hungry. I thought this strange, as we had afternoon tea at 4:30 p.m. at home, and nothing after that but a glass of milk. But I did settle in soon enough, and enjoyed my time there, though it wasn't for many years and after I had moved on that I actually looked forward to going back to school. Even going home for the holidays had its downside because it meant a visit to the dentist. Another and rather embarrassing memory of those first days at St Andrews was pocket money. I think my father thought he was being very generous when he gave me a shilling for the term, but it emerged that the going rate was more like 10 shillings, 50 pence in today's currency, and further funds had to be sought in a hurry. I felt sorry for my parents who had got it so wrong. Presumably Kenneth was remembering values from his own school days. This wasn't so daft, given that the standard postage rate in 1938 was 1.5 pence, which was only 50% up on the original penny post of 1840. The rate soon went up to 2.5 pence, but since we were made to write home every Sunday, postage for that alone would have come to some 2.5 shillings or half a crown, a quarter of my 10 shillings. And I did write home every week, proudly addressing the envelope to Commander and Mrs. Atkinson R.N., till it was pointed out to me that Mother wasn't actually in the Navy. The choice of St Andrews may have been connected with the visit to the Ashtons, because a near contemporary of mine turned out to be a young Ashton, who I always understood to be the lad I had met on the foraging expedition to Fareham. I don't remember him with affection, and oddly a great friend of his was David Ray, a childhood acquaintance of Janet. Rate and Ashton used to put on impromptu variety shows called Pinky and Perky shows for the amusement of us first formers. These took place in the Junior Hut, a single-storey extension at the back of the school that held an assembly area, the first form classroom, and the room occupied by the redoubtable Jolly Hockey Sticks music teacher Joan Dunkley. Another contemporary, though a year or two older than me, was Hugh Nichols, who was one of the group of young naval officers lost in the submarine affray in 1951. This boat sank in the Channel, and all attempts to save the crew failed. It is difficult to imagine the horror of being in that boat as the oxygen ran out, knowing there was no hope of rescue. By coincidence, another victim was an admired acquaintance of Janet in Cheshire, Robin Tugman. In 1955, Robin's brother Tim was working for ICI in Harrogate, and was very helpful in briefing me when I came to join that firm. On the 16th of August 1938, Commander Kenneth Atkinson was appointed Executive Officer of HMS Nelson, the flagship of Admiral Forbes, commanding the Home Fleet. Although about 15 years old, Nelson and her sister ship Rodney were the latest and most powerful capital ships in the Royal Navy. She was some 33,000 tons displacement, carrying 9 16-inch guns, the largest ever used by the Navy, except experimentally. During the next year, Nelson was presumably frequently in her home port of Portsmouth, and Kenneth was often at home, but I wouldn't have seen much of him having started boarding school life in September 1938. An early memory of Father's time with the Nelson is of a party at Lumley Croft. This party was unusual in that it was not for his fellow officers, but for the petty officers of the ship, whose respect and support must have made the executive officers' job easier. This might have been interpreted as a patronizing gesture, and may have been considered not quite good form by his superiors, but what I have learned since of Father's character make me sure that it was a genuine attempt at team building. I think it must also have been about this time that Father took me to my first football match. This was to Fratton Park, and Portsmouth's opponents in the old First Division were Arsenal, or the Arsenal as they were known in those days, and as it still is in my mind. The result was a goalless draw, and looking through the records I see that Portsmouth played 2 goalless draws against Arsenal in 1938, the only 2 such results between our move to Lumley Croft and the war. The first was in February, when we would still have been in Malta, and the other on Christmas Eve 1938. Since Portsmouth didn't meet Arsenal in the FA Cup in season 1938-39, when Pompey won the Cup, my first visit to Fratton Park may well have been a Christmas outing. Interestingly, one of Pompey's ever-present that season and their top scorer was Cliff Parker, who was playing that day. I saw Cliff Parker playing against Arsenal again when I started going to Fratton Park after the war. I remember the latter match, where I have forgotten most others because of a rather sneaky foul committed by Parker on the Arsenal and England fullback Laurie Scott. The date of that match must have been either Boxing Day 1946 or the 21st of April 1948. Whichever it was, Parker was in the twilight of his career, and not the player who scored 2 of Portsmouth's goals to win them the FA Cup in 1939. It must have been in this same period that we went to the Pavilion Cinema in Emsworth, where a newsreel was showing after-dinner speeches from Portsmouth's Guildhall, and for some reason Kenneth was among the speakers, briefly heard and glimpsed in flickery black and white. I have often wondered what the occasion was, and have speculated that it may have been the recommissioning of Nelson, when it would have been quite natural for the civic dignitaries to entertain key personnel from the most important ship in the Navy in its home port, but such pleasant occasions were soon to be no more. On the 3rd of July 1939, Kenneth wrote to his sister Violet in the Tanganyika, saying that all their plans were upset by this Hitler man. However, they had an independent summer cruise to Guernsey, which was cut short by orders to return to Portsmouth for a hurried refit and to give leave to the crew. A month early, so as to be ready for Hitler in August. So now, instead of being somewhere on the west coast of Scotland, we are in dock in Portsmouth doing a very hurried refit and giving leave. It's very nice to have our leave, but it's a terrific rush, and really being here at the moment is more hectic than when we're away, as we're trying to do 2 months refitting in 3 weeks. I was supposed to have gone off on leave last Friday, but cannot shake off the shackles. However, I'm hoping to get away this afternoon, and with any luck we shall go down to Goblin Combe for a few days, taking Jane with us tomorrow. None of us expects to get our full whack of leave before Hitler starts real trouble, and I think the government are very brave, or silly, to send us all away on leave at all under the circumstances. This is the first mention of Goblin Combe, the home of Kenneth's Aunt Phyllis, his mother's youngest sister, and her husband H.S. Bill Byrne and family. Goblin Combe became our second home for most of the war, as will appear later. A month later, the 2nd of August, Kenneth wrote to his sister again. We've been delayed owing to some damage to one of our 16-inch guns, and we only got out of the dockyard's clutches yesterday. We are taking on ammunition as fast as we can now, and hope to sail the day after tomorrow to join the rest of the fleet, which is already up at Invergordon. It's very nice to have another week at Portsmouth, but it means an awful rush for us when we do get up north. A week's work lost out of our normally rushed working up period is almost impossible to make up. A guest, John Pitt, had been staying at Lumley Croft, and had shown them cine pictures of life in Tanganyika, where Violet lived. Kenneth mused that time in this terrible Europe is so much more valuable than it is with you. Life goes on at full speed all the time, and there's no time for leisure. It's very, very sad, and will finish us off soon if things don't alter, I think. I'm sure the average person's nerves are worn out completely before they're 50 now, or will be if the life of the last 10 years continues. I often long to retire in New Zealand or Canada or South Africa and get back to a reasonable rate of living. Then, more brightly, though with false optimism, no, the war scare isn't nearly as bad as it was last autumn or even this spring, mainly because we are so much more ready for anything that may come and have become almost inoculated against crises. I feel war may easily be postponed indefinitely now, but I'm afraid we may lead this existence for another 5 years, and I'm not sure that's almost as bad as war. On the 3rd of September, war was declared. Nelson joined the fleet at Scapa Flow, and on the 19th of September Kenneth wrote to Violet, "Well, we are in a mess, aren't we?" And after some musing on Violet's situation in Tanganyika, he continues, "I can't really see that this war will be much different from the last one, as far as we are concerned in the Navy, although there may be terrific surprises in store for us. For civilians at the moment it looks very much the same, but I'm afraid in a few weeks the Holocaust may be let loose. Molly has had a complete houseful. Nurse, Jeremy and Jane, Joyce and her 2 children, Mrs. C and her 2 evacuees from London. However, the last 2 were quite impossible. They had no idea of discipline, wouldn't eat except with their fingers. wet their beds and did everything you would expect of them, and were of course miserable into the bargain. They have now been removed and put into a slum dwelling in the village where they are as dirty as they like, and in the seventh heaven. Molly is also driving one of the local ambulances when required, but seems to be quite happy about things, and I hope isn't worrying too much. Molly was 4 months pregnant at the time, thinking it was only 3. You are certainly lucky to be out of it now, and I hope you'll manage to form some bigger union of Africa out of the present fear of Nazism. I'm glad Egypt has come in so that there is very little chance of dissension in your continent, and I hope we shall have Spain, Italy and Turkey on our side before very long. I don't really imagine Italy will go quite as far as that, but it has always been said of her that she will never finish a war on the same side as she starts. And I certainly think she will remain neutral to the great glorification of Mussolini amongst his own people. If I only felt the Balkans would remain solid and not quarrel amongst themselves so that they will be strong enough to remain neutral, then I think we should have a reasonably short war. As it is, God knows. Needless to say, I can't give you any news of ourselves, but there's not much to say even if there was no censor. Mrs. C refers to Molly's mother, Mrs. Carruthers, Winnie, seemingly also escaping from the London area. I remember the 2 evacuees coming, and I feel sorry for them, thrust into a middle-class home with very little understanding on either side of the clash of cultures. I cringe at the snobbish language that came so naturally to my parents in those days. On the 15th of September, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, came aboard Nelson and spent a couple of days inspecting the defences of Scapa Flow and discussing the whole naval problem with Admiral Forbes and his senior officers. The rest of the fleet was hiding in Loch Ewe, supposedly a secret base, and on the 17th Nelson proceeded to rejoin the fleet there with Churchill on board. We have a photo of Kenneth waiting to greet Churchill on the brow gangway of the Nelson on Scapa Flow. For many years I thought this caption in my mother's writing was wrong. I knew Churchill was aboard Nelson in Loch Ewe, but I found no record of him having visited the ship in Scapa. It was only when I checked Churchill's own account, the Second World War 1959, that the above sequence became clear. This was confirmed by John Eberle, an RNVR midshipman aboard Nelson at the time, who wrote to me in 2003. I may be wrong, but I have a feeling that Churchill, as First Sea Lord, he clearly means First Lord of the Admiralty, came aboard in Scapa and reviewed the fleet, which would agree with your mother's caption. Further high-level discussions ensued. It is very unlikely that Kenneth, as a mere commander with a ship to manage, would have been party to any of these discussions, but at least we know he greeted the great man on arrival. When introduced to John Eberle by our cousin Andrew Byrne, I sent him a copy of the above photograph in the hopes that he could identify himself as the midshipman on the left of the picture. It wasn't him. The next letter to Violet was on the 25th of September, but of course there is no hint of the visit of Churchill, or of any other operational matters. Ken comments that her last letter had only taken 17 days from Tanganyika, while some of Molly's letters from Emsworth had taken as long as 16 days, though some as little as 6. He continues, "We seem to have settled down completely to the soul-destroying routine of war. It might have been going on for years instead of a mere 3 weeks. However, except for the fact that we seldom get ashore, I've had 1.5 hours this month, and the much worse fact that the sailor can't get any beer. Life isn't too bad. There are at any rate many worse places than a large battleship. I think I shall be glad of it when the winter gales come along. It's very nice of you to be thinking of me and praying. We shall need all your prayers. It's a miserable epidemic, this war, and as you say, such a senseless waste. I only hope it won't spread all over the world. I should feel better satisfied at the wreck of Europe if it was limited to Germany, France and England. At least there would be something left on which to build up again. I suppose we shall bomb one another to a standstill in a year or two, and then all three make terms with Russia to stop her invading what's left of Europe. I can quite imagine us all fighting Russia together then. The whole thing is so completely and utterly stupid that who we fight and where and why doesn't seem to matter in the very least. Today it's Hitler, tomorrow Bolshevism. However, if some sane countries like America and the Scandinavians keep out of it, then there may be hope. Molly seems well. The Ransfords, Sister Joyce and her daughters Jill and Wendy, are living with her now, but the two evacuees from London have gone to a home more to their liking. Mrs. C has apparently temporarily gone back to Beckenham, I'm thankful to say, and Jeremy has, I think, gone back to school, where he is now up in the 3rd form. I do hope the war won't interfere with his education. The Ransfords also lived in Beckenham, where Jill still lived at the time of writing this, 2010. She died in 2019. My surviving school reports make it clear that I only spent 1 term in the 1st form and 2 terms in the 2nd form, and indeed moved up into the 3rd form in the autumn of 1939. Despite the doubts about the safety of Scapa, the fleet seemed to have been using it as their main base. Ronald Careless reports that Nelson left Scapa on the 8th of October 1939 to search for the Gneisenau and the cruiser Köln. 6 days later, on my 9th birthday, a U-boat got into Scapa Flow and sank the Royal Oak with heavy loss of life. Instead of returning to Scapa, where the defences had been dramatically proved inadequate, the fleet proceeded to the secret base of Loch U, otherwise known as Port X. By this time, according to Careless, this base was not as secret as the Admiralty supposed, and the German Navy had a patrol line of submarines in place to intercept British ships. In fact, the Germans might have been supposed to be keeping a watch on Loch U, as it had been used as a secondary coaling base during World War I, almost from the beginning of that war. On the 30th of October, Nelson was hit by at least 2 torpedoes from a U-boat, but none exploded. The next letter to Violet, the 21st of November, was in reply to one that had apparently taken 2 months from East Africa. Ken returns to the theme of likely destitution after the war. Well, the war seems to have done you some good. I'm so glad, my dear, and I do hope they keep Don on now he's shown them how useful he is. Perhaps if the war goes on long enough, you'll find him chief engineer of many government works and factories. Then Molly and I and all our children will come and sponge on you when we're on our beam's end. It sounds grand having Anthony and David with you too, and I hope you succeed in getting them off to school together in Rhodesia in January. Jeremy is still at school, in the 3rd form now and enjoying himself thoroughly. He seems to have lots of friends and nearly every Sunday gets taken out by one of the other boys whose parents are down for the weekend. He seems in fact to be really popular with masters and boys and is doing quite well enough in work too. Apparently games are not his strong point, but he is considered reliable and has been given a job as air raid warden of the juniors' dormitory, which I gather entails following matron around with a torch when she darkens ship in the evening. Molly and Jane are very happy at home and have Joyce and her 2 little daughters living with them. Also occasional visitors. Our Norland nurse is still there, and life, I gather, is much more peaceful and easier than in peacetime. We aren't at all sorry we are having another baby, and would have done just the same if we had known a war was coming. We probably shan't be able to afford to educate any children after the war, but somehow that doesn't seem to matter much. I think everyone else will be in the same boat, and I imagine we shall have some form of state education. No, far from being sorry, we are delighted, and shall probably try and make a quartet later. Jane has stopped going to school as the school broke up, but Molly is teaching her, and with 2 other children always in the house, she doesn't miss the companionship of school. She'll love having a little sister. I understand that March the 28th is the great day. I'm quite happy too. I have about a quarter of the amount of work I had to do in peacetime and employ my spare time in making rugs and reading. We spend a tremendous lot of time at sea, and in really cold and rough weather too, but apart from that, I can't tell you how much because, as you say, our letters are censored. Not that I really know what's going on anyhow, except by listening to the wireless broadcasts. Not being on the staff, I hear no secrets, and never know where we are going or what we are going to do next. My main preoccupation is trying to keep 1,600 men happy, and not too bored when they can't get ashore for their amusements. I think I've been ashore 3 times now in as many months. It really makes dry land appear much nicer than it is. Kenneth's comment that he seldom got ashore at this period is confirmed by Careless, who wrote that the ship spent much time at sea trying to intercept one or other of the German heavy ships. However, Kenneth commented that he was quite enjoying life, what's left of it. In fact, life was about to change quite dramatically. At 8 a.m. on the 4th of December 1939, with the war just 3 months old, Nelson was returning to Loch Ewe in the darkness of the winter morning when, as recorded in the ship's log, there was an explosion under starboard bow. The position was given as 8½ cables on a bearing of 289 degrees from Leacon in the middle of the channel at the entrance to Loch Ewe. The cause of the explosion was a German magnetic mine, and the consequences for Kenneth's career and the family were enormous. There were no doubt serious consequences too for the 1 officer and 50 men or more who suffered injuries, some horrific. The ship itself had a large hole and started to flood. It took on a list of 3 degrees and was nearly 8 foot down by the bows. There was apparently some talk of beaching her, but the captain refused and she anchored off Ewe Island. The ship needed major repairs, which could only be carried out in dry dock, but first she had to be made seaworthy and anti-magnetic mine measures taken, the fitting of degaussing cable made, I believe, from telephone wire. Also a channel safe from mines had to be swept. Above all, the Germans must not know of their success and the sitting target Nelson offered. None of my father's letters home at this time has survived, but they would not have breathed a word of what had happened. The nearest hint I can see is in a letter to Violet, dated the 28th of December, in which Kenneth writes, "There's not much news for you, I'm afraid. We've had a very quiet time for several weeks now, but I don't suppose it'll last long. Christmas was dull, but I did manage to get ashore for an hour or 2 on Christmas Day, and we had a golf marathon up to the top of a hill and back again over heather and bogs, which gave us all a certain amount of exercise and fresh air." The enforced rest, a very quiet time, would not necessarily be quiet for the commander, whose usual administrative work, drafts and discipline, as well as training, continued. He would also, no doubt, have been responsible for maintaining morale, and the golf marathon mentioned would have been only one part of much sporting activity. Because it was realized at that early stage of the war that Nelson's anti-aircraft capability was inadequate, the light cruiser Cairo was detached from convoy duties and anchored close to Nelson as an additional floating anti-aircraft battery. Cairo had been launched in 1918 with an armament of 5 6-inch guns, but by 1939 had been rearmed with 4-inch high-angle guns. Her navigator was Lieutenant John Hayes, who much appreciated this detachment in Loch Ewe. He wrote in his book, Face the Music, 1991, that for the first time since the war started, they were able to relax, clean boilers, sleep at night, and above all stretch our legs in superb country by day. John Hayes had done his navigation course at Dryad just before the war, while Kenneth was there, but it is not clear that they ever came across each other during their enforced rest on and near Loch Ewe. Perhaps they met on the 20th of December when Nelson's log records Christmas Day routine, when players from Cairo came on board for a concert. That period did have a profound effect on John Hayes. It introduced him to Scotland, and after the war he made his home in that country and eventually, as Admiral Sir John, became Lord Lieutenant of the county of Ross and Cromarty. He will reappear in Kenneth's story. After a month or so in Loch Ewe, on the 4th of January 1940, Nelson, heavily escorted by minesweepers, made her way cautiously down to Portsmouth. Admiral Forbes had formally transferred his flag to Rodney, Nelson's twin, on the 1st of January, so the wardroom would have become much less crowded after the departure of the Admiral's staff. A happy and unexpected consequence of the Loch Ewe incident was that Kenneth reappeared at Lumley Croft in time to be present at the birth of his third child, my brother Jonathan Peter Johnny, on the 28th of February 1940. Kenneth described the event in a letter to Violet on the 11th of March. "We had another son nearly a fortnight ago, and this is the first you know about it, unless you happen to see it in the Weekly Times. I'm afraid even Jeremy saw it in the paper before he heard from us." Not strictly true. My headmaster saw it and sent his secretary to tell me. I remember exactly where I was when she found me. It all happened so suddenly a month before we expected it. Everyone except the baby had worked the date out wrong. I expect he'll be a mathematician. I was away for the day, having left Molly perfectly normal in the morning. When I returned at 9 p.m, I found Molly in bed, the nurse installed, and the baby about 7 hours old. It is a small baby, only about 7¼ pounds, I think, but appears strong and healthy. He has dark hair and no chin. Molly is very well and surrounded by flowers in our bedroom, and the weather has taken a hand by being continuously sunny ever since the arrival. Jane is simply thrilled and takes almost a personal pride in having produced a baby brother. She goes to school in the mornings and simply loves it. I don't think she learns much, but makes a lot of friends and seems to be the life and soul of the school. I'm amazingly lucky to be so near home all this time, but the war seems so peaceful at the moment that I don't feel I'm shirking. As you probably saw in the papers, the Nelson was mined last December, hence our rather prolonged refit. Johnny, or John as he preferred to be called latterly, died on the 1st of November 2011, after a varied and interesting life. The mining of Nelson was supposed to have been a closely guarded secret. It certainly was a well-kept secret from Molly, if from few others, as described in this letter of Kenneth's to Violet on the 17th of April 1940. Yes, Molly got rather a shock when she heard that Nelson had been mined too. She heard it on the wireless the same time as you did, I suppose. I was in the sitting room with her at the time, and it was rather amusing. I think she must have been one of the very few in the Portsmouth area who didn't know anything about it. The secret was quite well kept for about a month, but was rather more difficult to keep once we were on dock in Portsmouth. However, the whole is all patched up now. Jonathan was baptised in the ship's chapel, the Church of St. Nicholas, HMS Nelson, on Rogation Monday, 29th of April 1940, by the chaplain, Stanley M. Epps. The sponsors were G. Thistleton Smith, Jeremy Atkinson, and Brenda Ellaby. During Nelson's refit, perhaps on the day of Johnny's baptism, I was shown round some of the ship. 3 pictures have stayed with me. Apart from the chapel, I remember Kenneth's cabin, which was situated on the main deck, starboard side, behind one of the 6-inch high-angled gun turrets. The scuttle, the porthole, is clearly visible in the large-scale builder's model in the Discovery Museum in Newcastle. The ship was built by Vickers Armstrong. The peculiarity of the cabin was that it was split into a sort of L shape by the after starboard leg of the mainmast, which ran down through in at an angle from one corner of the middle of the deck. Kenneth's bunk was along the outboard side of the cabin, partly shielded by the trunk of the mast, and his desk and the door on the inboard side. My third memory of that visit was of looking down from the bridge onto the top of the main 16-inch gun turrets and being told that something very secret was going to be fitted there, which my father couldn't tell me about. A few years ago I realized that the secret weapon may have been Professor Lindemann's unrotated projectile, UP, designed to launch a drifting aerial minefield, which was fitted to the ship at the time, and which Ronald Careless describes as Professor Lindemann's brainchild, and never successful, though Churchill was said to have been very keen on it. I don't know whether they were tested during my father's time in Nelson, but I was told by John Eberle that they were only tested once, with near disastrous results, and then removed. Careless records that at the same time as the UPs, the ship was fitted with additional, more conventional anti-aircraft defences and Type 279-281 radar. These types were still only just obsolete when I started teaching the elements of radar theory at HMS Dryad in 1953. I can't be certain of the type numbers now, but I feel we still had a Type 281. The main air and sea guard sets in 1953 were 277 and 293, working on a 10 cm wavelength, with 3 cm wavelength sets coming in for navigation. The heart of the centimetric types was the mysterious cavity magnetron, another product of Professor Lindemann's team. It was brilliantly successful and greatly impressed the Americans to whom it was offered, though it was very difficult to explain to a class of sailors, largely because I didn't really understand how it worked myself. On the 6th of June, Nelson left Portsmouth to complete her repairs on the Clyde. Molly's parents were looking after Lumley Croft, and she, with Jane and Jonathan, had moved to Goblin Combe. This is described in 2 letters to Violet, headed HMS Nelson, care of GPO, the first dated the 17th of June 1940. Just a line, as this is probably the last time for many a long day that I shall be able to get a letter to you. I expect that this will take long enough and mails may be very few and far between. I think you're lucky being cut off from England at the moment. As long as we can hold Egypt and the French don't capitulate in North Africa as they have done in France, I suppose East Africa is fairly safe. Of course, if we lose the Mediterranean, I'm afraid it'll be the same for all of us. Anyhow, we're all in good heart at the moment, although very worried about our families, of course. However, I think the Metropolitan Air Force will hold its own and not allow quite the same extent of bombing in England as there has been in France. It's all rather like a bad dream, isn't it? I haven't seen Molly and my children for some time now. Jeremy, of course, is still at school. Jane has gone down to live with Goblin Combe, and I hope Molly and Jonathan will soon be following. I had hoped to see Molly next weekend, but I'm afraid that's off now. I've never known a summer quite like this in England. We've had absolutely perfect cloudless weather now for about 2 months, and it's really quite hot. The fruit and flowers are better than I've ever known them. Why we have to fight wars in such lovely weather, God knows. Let's hope it's the last one anyway. God bless you, and don't forget to reserve a bit of Tanganyika for what's left of us. Lots of love from us all. Kenneth. That perfect cloudless summer of 1940 was critical to the outcome of the war. The evacuation from Dunkirk was completed on the 4th of June. Italy declared war on Britain and France on the 10th of June, and the air battle of Britain was about to start in a month or so. Meanwhile, Kenneth had been able to visit me at school, and we had some time together on the river at Goring, where we had fun navigating our punt into backwaters, as if on an expedition up the tributaries of the Amazon. The second letter to Violet was written 10 days later on the 27th of June, presumably from the Clyde. It illustrates the difficulty of wartime communication before the days of international, let alone mobile phones. Our phone at Lumley Croft was still a black daffodil with detachable earpiece and the original number Emsworth 11, and of course a manual exchange by which the operator had to put you through to your destination, sometimes having to plot a cross-country route to avoid bottlenecks. Part of that second letter reads, "Your letter has taken over 2 months. It was written on April 19th, but I expect that will be quite normal now. It's funny to think of you writing it before even Holland and Belgium were invaded, and now not only them but the whole of France has been overrun. Things certainly move fast now. However, I agree with the Toronto Observer or Winnipeg Star or whatever paper it was, which said that none of Britain's remaining allies are likely to let her down. It's a most extraordinary situation, with dozens of governments or pseudo-governments of different countries, all congregated in England, and the remainder of Europe in German hands. It's very like certain periods of the Napoleonic Wars, and it will end the same way provided we can hold out in England. I wish we could evacuate all our children, and then I think we could stand anything, but we started rather late to realise the horrid necessity. Molly and children have evacuated Lumley Croft just when all the vegetables and fruit were coming on beautifully, and I rather hope to get them to America with Pippa and Richard Byrne. I believe Bill has got some scheme to do that. Molly and Jane and Jonathan are at present at Goblin Combe, living in their caravan. I saw Molly this last weekend. We've been terribly lucky to see so much of one another. She's always very capable when I'm away, and will look after the children marvellously whatever happens. I'm sorry to say, though, that she was looking rather thin again and worried. She's been looking so well the last 2 years, since we got back from Malta. I'm very fit and quite enjoying life. We've seen nothing much of the fighting to date, but I've no doubt we'll get our fill before we finish. I am still in Nelson, but my 2 years are up next month, and I suppose I might quite possibly get a shift, although it's not really likely unless I get promoted. The half-yearly promotions come out in a few days now, and if it had ever been peacetime, I should have been very excited because 2 years as commander of the fleet flagship usually means promotion. However, it doesn't seem to matter now, and in any case, I'd much rather remain in this ship." The same day, the 27th of June, he wrote to Molly at Goblin Combe, after what seems to have been a farewell dinner the night before. Since Nelson was on the Clyde, perhaps Molly had gone up to Glasgow for a few days. "Darling Molly, the crab and Volnay did me a power of good. I felt really fit this morning despite a slightly disturbed night. I hope you had no air raids on the way down and had a pleasant trip. Write and tell me all about it, won't you? And also how things were in Bristol, and how the children are, and what the chances are of getting to America. I'm longing to hear from you. The weather, of course, has been much nicer since you left. Wasn't it miserable of it to go bad on us for the weekend? However, I loved having you here, and hope that at any rate you had a bit of rest, which I think you needed. You mustn't go and wear yourself to a shadow, you know. It's no good getting worried, and the children need you at your very strongest and most cheerful. I had a letter from Violet today. For the first time she appears to be depressed. It must be very miserable for her, separated by hundreds of miles from her children and with nothing to do, or nothing like her usual amount of work. I've written and tried to cheer her up. Our main job is to try and keep cheerful now, I think, and hold on. We'll do it too. I've started to read Brett Young's book and find it's all about the war in Tanganyika in 1916, and not a novel at all. Still, it's quite well written and may be interesting, so I'll stick to it for a bit. Will you get some snaps of the children and send them to Violet sometime soon? I think she'd like them. And another letter followed the next day, because he had forgotten to enclose Violet's letter. I hear by the news that Russia has started. It's all getting unutterably complicated, isn't it? I can't make up my mind whether it's a good thing or not about Russia. I don't imagine she'll let Germany have the oil, but on the other hand the whole movement may be aimed at the Near East or eventually India, hoping for a break-up of the British Empire. I do hope we shall give Italy a really rude shock soon. I mistrust this waiting about, doing nothing. I hope I shall hear from you tomorrow. I hate to go away to sea and not know what you are doing about America, so let me know quickly, won't you? And don't ask me any important questions, because there's always the possibility we may be at sea for weeks on end and not get your letter for ages. Don't worry if you don't hear for a long time, for that very reason too. On the 30th of June, the half-yearly promotions came out.